Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we're talking about something interesting. We're talking about a character created by the great Robert E. Howard, my favorite writer of all time, but we're not talking about Conan. We're going to be talking about this character. This is Solomon Kane. My second favorite Robert E. Howard character. Solomon Kane, the Puritan adventurer and righter of wrongs, who felt himself to have a mission from God to fight evil, when actually he just wanted to go out and have a bunch of adventures. Really interesting character. Some great stories that Robert E. Howard wrote about Solomon Kane, and they're all available in this book from Del Rey. He didn't write a ton of stories about Solomon Kane, but the ones he wrote were pretty darn good. And so, yeah, they're all available here. And because Conan was such a great success in comic books, naturally, Roy Thomas, who brought Conan to comics in Marvel Comics, they decided to, try out some other characters like King Kull and Solomon Kane. And so there were some Solomon Kane adventures published over the years. He never had as many adventures in comic books as Conan did. He was never as popular as that character, not even close, really. But he's such an interesting character, and he did have his share of adventures published by Marvel Comics. And they are all available in this. This is the Solomon Kane, the original Marvel Years Omnibus that was published a while back. I am happy to say that the current owner of the license for Robert E. Howard characters, Heroic Signatures and Titan Comics, they are going to reprint this. So you can get this, which is awesome, because there's some good stuff in here. And what Roger and I are going to talk about today is Solomon Kane's first appearance in a colored comic book. Solomon Kane first appeared in Black and White Comics, Marvel's black and white line of comic books. And he had a few adventures published that way in Black and White magazines. But they wanted to try him out in a regular color comic book, where Conan had become such a success. And so they had to figure out how they were going to do that. So he had his first couple of adventures in Marvel Premiere, starting with Marvel Premiere 33. And the title of the feature was The Mark of Kane. So not Solomon Kane, The Mark of Kane. So why did they make that change? That's a good question. Unfortunately, this omnibus does not have a gigantic introduction by Roy Thomas like the Conan omnibuses do, where he doubtless would give all the information about why they made that change. But it was, probably just because it sounded cool, The Mark of Kane. And Solomon Kane was not a character that many people knew. So it didn't have any name recognition at all. So, let's do The Mark of Kane. And put Solomon Kane in this comic book, in this story, which is based on the Solomon Kane story, Red Shadows, by Robert E. Howard. It was written, of course, by Roy Thomas and illustrated by Howard Chaykin. Howard Chaykin, who's had a long career in comics filled with controversy. I mostly knew him for the longest time because he did the Star Wars comic book adaptation. That's how I knew Howard Chaykin, Star Wars comics. Later on, he did a very interesting version of The Shadow, which had some excellent art, and it had excellent art. I'll give it that. But he's done a bunch of stuff over the years in comics. And this is some of his earlier work on Solomon Kane, The Mark of Kane. Here, in the very beginning, Solomon Kane battles some evil cultists. This, of course, was not in the original Red Shadows story, but we'll get to that story in a minute. This is just to introduce what a badass Solomon Kane is and how you don't mess with this avenger of wrongs. Now, Chaykin's version of Solomon Kane is pretty darn good. He does look suitably dour, and the artwork in this issue is pretty darn good, I have to say. It's got a lot of style to it, and it's got a lot of energy. Now, there is one glaring difference that you'll spot right away if you're a Solomon Kane fan with this version of Solomon Kane, and that is he doesn't have his hat. Where's Solomon Kane's hat? So, Solomon Kane wears a hat. It's part of his costume and part of his distinct look. It's taking away Solomon Kane's hat is kind of like taking away Indiana Jones' hat. You just don't, there's no reason to do it. But they decided to change that, and I'm not sure why. Again, we don't know, or I don't know. I'm sure somebody knows. Somebody out there knows. Why did they take Solomon Kane's hat? You know, my theory is that at this time, Chaykin just couldn't draw a good hat. I mean, he learned a few years later by the time he got to the Shadow. But at this point, maybe he just couldn't draw a hat. Or maybe they just wanted this particular look. You know, they've got, almost everything else right. And they certainly got his personality right. So in Red Shadows, famously, Solomon Kane, in his travels, comes across this young woman who's dying. She's been terribly injured and ravished, and she's going to die. And he has no idea who this is. It's a perfect stranger to him. But, he decides, what? Someone's going to pay for this. And famously, in this scene, Solomon Kane vows, men shall die for this. And he goes on a long quest to exact revenge and seek justice for this young woman who has been murdered by this fellow right here, Leloup, the evil villain. And so, over time, Solomon Kane hunts this guy down. He's a bandit leader, and Solomon Kane slowly kills all the bandits and hunts them down. And this is Leloup. He's in his cave. He's being hunted down by Solomon Kane, and he needs to escape. He kills off one of his own guys, but he doesn't get away in time. There's Solomon Kane. And they have a fight in the cave. It's a pretty good one. This is a good, I have to say, this is a good adaptation of this story, which is no surprise because Roy Thomas did it. Lots of action in this version. There is another version of Red Shadows, I should say, that Marvel did years later, which I'll show you in a minute. So, Leloup gets away, and Solomon Kane still has to hunt him down. We've also got this little bit here. This is from the mail page, where Roy Thomas gives a history up to this point of Solomon Kane and Solomon Kane in comics, because he had appeared in a lot of black and white issues, or some black and white issues of Kull and the Barbarians, which was a short-lived black and white magazine. After the color issues that I'm showing you now, Solomon Kane went on to appear once in a while in the Savage Sword of Conan. It was kind of like a long feature of Solomon Kane that would appear now and again. So that was the first issue. And then we get to issue 34, which is awesome because you have a giant ape on the cover. Now, giant apes always do very well on comic book covers. Nothing sells a comic book like a giant ape. And they knew that. And fortunately, this story by Robert E. Howard has a giant ape. And there's our hero, Solomon Kane. Now he doesn't even have a shirt, poor fella. He lost his hat. He lost his shirt. And so Solomon Kane travels to Africa, which is where Leloup, the evil bandit leader, has fled. And now we're going to get some spooky magic going on, some weird stuff happening. And so Solomon Kane trails Leloup through the jungle, and he gets knocked out, which is something that happens to pulp characters with alarming frequency. They get knocked out. They suffer frequent concussions. It's a whole thing. So anyway, he has been knocked out and dragged to this village where he's going to be killed. And he does meet a character that becomes his friend. He meets Nalanga, who is a magician. And he talks to Nalanga here. Now, this is an interesting point in Solomon Kane's life, because he's kind of an uptight Englishman, very religious guy. He doesn't, he doesn't think much of sorcerers, let's just say, but he does eventually become friends with this guy Nalanga, and it actually changes his character over time in the stories. And he takes a much more open view of different cultures and things. But here he's very suspicious of Nalanga, and we see that Leloup has gotten into a position of power in this tribe. There's the chief, there's our evil villain, there's a big statue of a horrific god, and we get some supernatural things that happen. We get a man brought back from the dead, and Solomon Kane manages to escape and track down Leloup again. And this all follows the story pretty closely. And like I said, the artwork has a lot of energy to it. I like this version of Red Shadows quite a bit, even though Solomon Kane doesn't have his hat, And we do get the giant gorilla at the end, who actually ends up rescuing Solomon Kane in a way, which is kind of cool. And so by the end, Solomon Kane's mission is complete. But Solomon Kane in the Mark of Kane only lasted those 2 issues of Marvel Premiere. He never landed his own comic. I guess these stories just didn't sell as well or well enough to merit that. But Solomon Kane did return in another story with art by Howard Chaykin. And so over the years, we get a lot of Solomon Kane adventures. Eventually, Solomon Kane gets his hat back. And years later, we got a 6-issue limited series of Solomon Kane called The Sword of Solomon Kane. And here we have, in this one issue, we get a shorter adaptation of that same story, Red Shadows, with some pretty good artwork by Steve Carr and Brett Blevins. Ralph Macchio does the script this time instead of Roy Thomas. But he does a decent enough job. And the character of Solomon Kane in this seems like a much darker character. He seems a bit more to me in this version like the character that you would read about in the original stories. That seems like a pretty good representation of Solomon Kane to me. And it's a different version. This doesn't quite have the action or the style that the Chaykin version had. So I do like the mood of this, but it doesn't have the same action that you'd get in that other version of Red Shadows. But still, it's pretty excellent. And so they did a couple excellent versions of this story. Although, yeah, the action, when there is action, doesn't quite move like Chaykin's work does. Still, it was a good issue. Although it does seem in the scenes where action does happen pretty static, which is not the case with Chaykin. Chaykin's work moved. So, but it's not bad, like I say. And I do appreciate that Solomon Kane got his hat back. So this was a 6-issue series, which was excellent altogether. And like I said, there wasn't much. If you compare Solomon Kane to Conan, I mean, Conan went on for years and years and years in his own comic and in Savage Sword of Conan. And Solomon Kane was just a backup feature, and there wasn't much of it comparatively. So he's always been a less popular character, but a very, very interesting character. I love Solomon Kane. Steve Donoghue, my partner here on Epic Comic Book Wednesday, does not feel the same. He will accuse me of being a dude bro for liking Solomon Kane. A dude bro is apparently somebody who doesn't like what Steve Donoghue likes. I figured that out. But Solomon Kane, I like him a lot. And like I said, he is getting his omnibus reprinted by Titan Comics and Heroic Signature, and they are coming out with a new miniseries. That should be coming out later this year, I think. So that's awesome. It's good that Solomon Kane is back. And that was his first color adventure in comics. So there you go, the Mark of Kane. I will catch you next time.